أهلاً وسهلاً بكم في مصر. شرفتونا. Hello. Welcome to Egypt. My name is Hassan, and for the next few weeks, I will be your guide around this country of mine. For hundreds of years, Egypt has caught the imagination of people all over the world. Every year, they come in their millions to wonder and marvel at its sights and its sounds. Can you guess what river this is? It is the Nile. The Nile is vital to Egypt. Without this river, my country would just not exist at all. I'll tell you why. In Egypt, it almost never rains, so the Nile provides Egypt with all its water. The water to grow the crops and feed the people. Without the Nile, there would just be desert. No food, no people, no Egypt. The farmers working on the land today depend on the Nile just as much as their ancestors have done for century after century. As the Greek historian Herodotus once said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It flows not just through Egypt, but several countries. It starts off as two rivers, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile starts in the high mountains of Ethiopia at Lake Tana. The source of the White Nile is the lakes of Central Africa. From there, it flows north into the Sudan, until eventually it joins the Blue Nile just south of Khartoum. Then the One River Nile crosses the border into Egypt and flows the whole length of the country, from Aswan in the south to Cairo in the north. On its banks, there is a narrow strip of good farmland, but beyond that lie miles and miles of dry, barren desert. At its northern end, before it reaches the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile divides up into several separate channels to form the delta. Today, the delta is an area of flat, fertile farmland. But thousands of years ago, the delta and much of the Nile Valley was marshland, teeming with all sorts of wildlife. Artists of ancient Egypt painted pictures of the animals and birds which lived by the Nile. The river was alive with fish. Fish of all shapes, sizes, and colors. Millions of ducks, geese, and other kinds of waterfowl made their home in the reeds by the riverside. Larger animals, too, lived by the banks of the Nile. Many of these animals have totally disappeared from Egypt now, but 3,000 years ago, they were there in great numbers. It was this vast amount of wildlife which brought Egypt its first people, the hunters. They hunted the birds with throwing sticks to knock them out of the air, and hunting cats to catch them when they fell to the ground. In their nets, they caught huge shoals of fish. And the larger animals were hunted down with spears and arrows. Over the centuries, these hunters gradually settled on the land and became farmers, taming and herding the wild animals. They cultivated the land on the banks of the Nile, and their settlements grew and prospered, and eventually developed into one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. Egypt became the land of the pharaohs. All these magnificent buildings and monuments were made possible by the wealth created from the Nile and the farmland on its banks. These farms were laid out on the flat stretches of land just above the river. Above that land, on the edge of the desert, were the villages of the farmers. Farmland was too precious to be used for houses. Year by year, life for these farmers followed a very regular pattern. This pattern had 3 seasons, and these seasons were set by the Nile. You see, the Nile didn't stay the same size all year round. This was a waterfall on the Blue Nile at the beginning of June. And this was the same waterfall 2 months later. Between June and August every year, there is a huge increase in the amount of water. This is caused by the rain and melting snow in Ethiopia. Great torrents of water surge down the river. All this extra water swept northwards into Egypt, where it caused the Nile to rise and overflow its banks. Normally by September, the strips of farmland were completely flooded. This flood season not only brought water to the dried out land, it also brought mud or silt carried by the river. After about 4 months, when the flooding went down, this silt settled, covering the land with a new layer of dark, fertile soil. This was rich land for the farmers to plow and sow during the next 4 months, which was their growing season. After that came the harvest, when the crops were gathered in and put into stores. A good harvest was needed to give the people enough food to last them until the next flood season. For the farmers of the Nile Valley, the size of the flood was often a matter of life or death. Too small a flood could mean a poor harvest and starvation for many people. Too big a flood, and whole villages could be swallowed up by the waters of the Nile. So it's not surprising that the changes in the level of the Nile were closely watched. I have come down to the banks of the Nile to show you this. It's called a Nilometer. There are many of these up and down the Nile. Have you guessed what it did? Follow me and I'll show you. Egyptian officials used these Nilometers to forecast what the height of the flood was likely to be. This Nilometer measured the height of the Nile. Each of these marks showed the level of the water. There are marks all the way up the staircase. Unfortunately for Egyptians, the flood wasn't always the same size. If the water came only up to here, then the land wouldn't be covered, the crops would be bad, and there might even be famine. If the water went up right to the top of the staircase, there might be catastrophe, with houses being swept away, and animals and people drowning. The Egyptian officials kept a close watch on how quickly the flood water rose up these steps. If it was rising slowly, then a poor harvest was the forecast. But if it was rising quickly to the top of the staircase, then it was time to put the flood emergency plans into action. As well as being experts at measuring water, the ancient Egyptians were experts at managing it and moving it. One device they invented is called a shadoof. It works a bit like a seesaw. A heavy weight at one end of the pole helps to pull up the water at the other end. It's such a good way of lifting water onto the fields that many are still used today. The ancient Egyptians used animal power rather than human power for another of their water-lifting machines, the sakya. This water wheel uses clay pots to lift up and pour out the water, which then runs along channels and out into the fields. Small earth dams are opened and shut to make the water go where it's needed. Irrigating the land properly means you have to make a whole network of channels, from small trenches to full-scale canals. A good irrigation system is just as important to us, modern Egyptians, as it was to the ancient Egyptians. In those days, they had to rely on muscle power to dig out all the water channels. On the really big projects, hundreds of men, sometimes thousands, had to be organized and made to work together in teams. Organization and teamwork also came into play at the time of the annual flood. To escape the floods, thousands of people left their usual homes and lived together on highland, out of reach of the water. As they couldn't work on their farms, all these people could be called upon to work on big projects for their god-king, the pharaoh. It was this labor force which built the pyramids. Most of the stone these pyramids are made of was quarried locally, but some of it had to be brought nearly 1,000 kilometers from the mountains in southern Egypt near Aswan. How do you think it was transported all that distance? By river, of course. The Nile was like a great big motorway, running the whole length of the country. It was a motorway that could be used in both directions, north and south. We are now traveling up north, and the current of the Nile is carrying us along quite nicely. But what happens if we want to go south? How can we go against the current? I suppose we could row, but it would take a very long time and be a lot of hard work. There's a much better way of going upstream. By sail. Fortunately for the Egyptians, the wind on the Nile usually blows from north to south, so you can sail upstream against the current. In the days of the pharaohs, many boats and ships traveled up and down the Nile, ferrying goods and people from one place to another. But boating wasn't all business for the Egyptians. They used to cruise in boats very much like this one, for the sheer pleasure of it. And you can understand why. Cruising on the Nile is still very popular today, but some of the boats don't need sails to propel them up the river. These Nile cruisers aren't used all that much by Egyptians. They are for the foreign tourists. In the past, there were times when these cruisers couldn't reach certain places on the tourist route because the waters of the Nile fell to too low a level. Now the Nile's water level doesn't change much, and there is no annual flood anymore. This change in the way the Nile acts is all due to one single phenomenon, the Aswan Dam. The Aswan Dam is the largest dam in the world. 35,000 people worked day and night for 11 years to build it. By blocking the course of the Nile here, the Egyptians created the biggest artificial lake in the world, Lake Nasser. Hundreds of villages and towns disappeared under the waters of Lake Nasser. Many historical buildings of great importance and beauty looked as if they might have been submerged forever. Massive rescue operations had to be mounted to save them. The most famous of these were the temples of Ramses II and Queen Nefertari at Abu Simbel. Dismantling these temples and moving them to a new site was an amazing feat of 20th century technology. You could easily compare this achievement to the skill and craft of the ancient Egyptians, who made the temples in the first place. They had been carved out of the solid cliff face. Now they had to be cut up into over 2,000 huge blocks and moved up and away from the rising waters. The Aswan Dam has produced two main benefits. Firstly, it has tripled Egypt's supply of power. The force of the water has been harnessed to produce vast amounts of electricity, which has helped Egypt to develop its factories and industries. The second big benefit of the dam is that by controlling the flow of the Nile, the amount of land that is farmed has been increased by about a third. As well as the creation of new farmland, control of the river has also made old farmland more productive. Some farms can now have up to 4 harvests in 1 year. However, the Aswan Dam hasn't been all good news for Egypt. The dam has stopped the fertile silt from reaching the farmland below the dam. Now, expensive artificial fertilizers have to be spread on the fields, and in time, this might damage the environment. No one can tell yet whether the story of the Aswan Dam is a success or a failure. We'll just have to wait and see. But whatever happens, Egypt was and will remain forever the gift of the Nile.
This week, Quantum visits Kalgoorlie, soon to become the world's largest single source of the acid gas sulfur dioxide. Also research into the 18-million-year-old ancestor of the apes. Just some of the stories in Quantum tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Stay with us now for Behind the News.